Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 638 podcast. Today, we're going to be running through all the Star Wars movies. I'm joined by my two friends, Shulman and Alex. How are you guys doing today?
Doing well, Steve. Doing well. Excited to be here. Thank you for having us.
All right, that's
I'm
great.
excited. Uh, can't wait to share my somewhat controversial opinions on Star Wars with everybody.
Oh, I'm sure you guys will. So, if you guys don't know, we're 20 something year olds. We kind of grew up, I guess you could say, in the prequel generation. And when we were closer to that 16 to 20-year-old range, that's when the sequel trilogy came out. So, we've definitely grown up loving Star Wars. I know all of us are pretty big fans, and we all have very different opinions about Star Wars, which is not surprising considering how controversial and split the fan base has been, especially the past few years. Now, how we made this list is essentially Alex Schulman and me. We all made our individual lists. Then we took the average of all of our lists and came up with one master list. Now, this list doesn't necessarily reflect the opinions of any of us, I guess you could say, but this is what happens when three Star Wars fans with differing opinions decide to make one list together with equal say. So without further ado, let's just kick this right off. Coming in at number 11, we have episode 8, The Last Jedi. Now, personally, I put The Last Jedi at number 10, so not too far off from 11. Me personally, one of the reasons I did not like The Last Jedi as much, I think as a standalone movie, it could be considered a good movie. But in the context of these big franchises like Star Wars and Marvel, you always have to be thinking about what's next and what's going to come after that. And I really feel like Ryan Johnson didn't take into consideration a lot of those things. And he not only made some decisions within The Last Jedi that I did not particularly like spoiler alert, killing Snoke, but he also left the series into a creative hole where it was really, really hard to make another movie after The Last Jedi. Now I want to kick it over to you guys and see your personal opinions about The Last Jedi and how you feel it ended up here on the list.
All right,
I'll go ahead. Oh,
I'm gonna let Alex go first because his opinion is most similar to yours on this movie.
all right. So I had The Last Jedi right where it is on this list. I had it dead last, but I had a similar but slightly different reason to Steve. Steve didn't like how you were able to not build off of this movie. But my biggest gripe was how it left so many of the questions from The Force Awakens unanswered. I left the theater after watching Force Awakens with a lot of questions such as who are Rey's parents? What did that lightsaber that Rey found with Maz, where did that come from? And I was expecting to get some or all of those answers during The Last Jedi, and I really got absolutely nothing. And I got what felt like a film from a completely different saga. And that's why I had the film dead last on my list.
Okay. Going and looking at my list, I have The Last Jedi ranked 8 on my list. So it is there are a few movies that are definitely definitely much worse than The Last Jedi, in my opinion. Well, I agree that The Last Jedi has its flaws and has its problems. I think overall, it has some of the has a lot of highs and a lot of lows that are very extreme. Whereas some of the movies that I ranked below it, I feel like while their highs don't get as high as the Last Jedi's, but their lows don't get as low. They're more consistent movies, but the peaks that this movie reaches does it for me better than some of the other ones. To go off of some of your points about the expectations you had going into this movie, and that it didn't live up to what the what you wanted in terms of like the answers to some of these questions. I don't think it's necessarily this movie's fault that like those some of those questions weren't answered. Like some of those questions were answered in other media, and that's the beauty of Star Wars as a franchise is that we have these movies, and there are things like the Clone Wars show or the Rebels show or the comics and the video games that really like flesh out all the details. Like it would have been nice to get an explanation in the movies about where Maz got that lightsaber from, but at the end of the day, it's not like it doesn't ruin this movie for me because I didn't see that. And there were a lot of questions that were answered from the other movies, but a lot more questions came as a result of that. They weren't very like fulfilling, a lot of those answers. As for like setting this movie up for like sequels and where the franchise can go from there, I actually think that this movie worked a lot to set up the direction for the future to go. I think that public backlash against a lot of the decisions in this movie hurt that a lot and has made Disney start to back off from like sticking with those decisions that they made. Like for instance, the broom boy at the end was a controversial subject, even though he's in the movie for like 3 seconds. There's a kid using the force to grab a broom, and it's supposed to represent that the story of Luke Skywalker throughout the movie is inspiring other people that there are force sensitive kids out there and millions and there's a whole new generation being inspired, and people didn't like that. They're like, oh, this kid is stupid, why is he got a broom or whatever, and any hint of like other force sensitive kids or people in this universe is we haven't seen any hint of that since then. Because so I feel like it's just a lot of like the decisions in this movie they could have had a lot of sequels for it and they could have gone through with it, but a lot of the backlash to it kind of prevented that from happening, and they got apprehensive about that.
I
But
do want to ask. Oh, sorry. I didn't want to cut you off. I wanted to ask you a follow up question. Actually, I was wondering. You mentioned the backlash. I was wondering, do you think some of the backlash, because it did get a ton of backlash, it was very most controversial movie in the series by far. Do you think some of the backlash was warranted? If so, or if not, why?
yeah, I think that the backlash in this movie, like there were a lot of smart decisions and a lot of dumb decisions. I think the biggest like problem I have with this movie, I feel like doesn't get talked about often, is that like the thing I don't like about this movie the most is that it takes place like 5 minutes after the end of The Force Awakens, because those movies take place like so close to each other in time period. They're essentially like a part one, part two, and so there's not a lot of like build up between where the characters are. If you look back at other movies in the franchise that are sequels from each other, there's always a little gap, whether it be like a couple years or a couple months. There's always time that our characters have grown and been shaped by the experiences that they've had. But in this movie, a lot of the decisions that were made had to be because like we knew exactly where they were left off. One of the big problems people have with this movie is that how powerful Rey is after barely any training, and I feel like that would have been mitigated a lot if it had been like a few months before she had managed to get her way to Luke. She was traveling across the galaxy a bit, solving some problems while she was trying to get her way there. She was following the map, but there were things in the way that she had to do, and I feel like that would have been good for the movie. The other big problems people have with the movie are the Canto Bite, the casino planet, which
Mm-hmm.
it's a boring scene. Like that whole sequence is kind of boring and it serves no purpose because of they undo some of the stuff later. But the big problem with those for me is the slow moving chase scene, where the whole movie, Poe's storyline and the whole Resistance are in this slow speed chase against the First Order. And when I'm watching a movie with a chase scene, I want to see some high stakes. I want things to be going fast and to be you know they're narrowly like dodging obstacles and stuff. But in this movie, they're kind of just chilling there, like they're hurrying up and waiting. They just sit around waiting for something to happen, and they just so they're because but they're only in that case because of the other stuff. So there's a lot of problems with this movie, but I think that a lot of the hate isn't as warranted as people make it out to be.
Right. I mean, overall, I'd agree with you. Like, The bottom line on The Last Jedi, just the last word in it, is it's going to be a controversial Star Wars movie for a long, long time. And the fan base is going to be split in two different directions, which, again, the three of us combining our lists, I can definitely understand why it ranked so low because of how controversial it is. Now, with that, let's just move right on to number 10 on our list. We have The Phantom Menace, Episode 1. Now, I will say, I only have a couple hot takes on this list. One of my hot takes is I actually enjoy The Phantom Menace quite a lot. Not a lot to put it super high on my list, but a lot to put it at number 7 on my personal list. Now, some things about The Phantom Menace that I think are underappreciated is how much world building was created in The Phantom Menace in comparison to the beginning trilogy, I guess you could say. That a lot of the Star Wars that we know today and a lot of the time period that is really fleshed out in other mediums such as the Clone Wars, it had really began by the world building of the Phantom Menace. Now, I understand that the relationships and the main characters in the Clone Wars weren't necessarily developed within the Phantom Menace, but having a broader perspective on the Star Wars universe while being able to build and create bold new characters, even Jar Jar Binks, that was a bold decision. You know, I give George Lucas a lot of respect for making that film and making something very different than what the original trilogy was and not being afraid of doing that. Now I want to let's throw this over to Shulman to get the first word on this one, and then Alex will get the second word on this topic.
All right. Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. On my list, it is also in 10th spot. One above another movie that has not come up yet on this list. My thoughts about this movie, Qui-Gon is a very interesting character and a very cool character. For the story reasons, I get why he had to die, and it really sets up Obi-Wan and his journey throughout the series. And it does a lot of world building for the franchise, but it also kind of convolutes a lot of things. There's the infamous, the midichlorians, is that, where there's a tangible way to the Force instead of being what Obi-Wan says in the first movie, and it just kind of ruins that whole concept where like everyone experiences the Force. It's a thing to having, but only certain people are strong enough to be attuned with it. Darth Maul is a cool character, design-wise, and that's probably one of the best action scenes in the franchise, but he's a wasted character and is only redeemed through the Clone Wars. And Duel of Fates is top 5 track in the entire series, and that's all I really got to say about this one.
All right, Alex, you have any words on The Phantom Menace?
Yes, I do, and I also had this at number 10, so right where it is on the list. But this is a movie that I've gone back and forth on quite a bit. I do enjoy watching it, and I always, if I see it on TV, I'll stop by and watch because it is such an important piece of the whole saga. You get introduced to not only these characters, these worlds, but these concepts, and they come in while you've already been introduced to some of them from the original trilogy. When you bring in this prequel trilogy, you have so much change in technology that has happened that they're able to do so much more and open up so many more possibilities for what goes into being part of a Star Wars movie. With that being said, it doesn't really do too much in terms of progressing the story. And we'll talk about this when we get to a different movie, but the prequels were very limited in what they were able to do because you knew how the prequels had to end. And this movie, I felt, didn't really advance much from when we picked up the timeline to when we left the timeline at the end of this movie. It didn't really advance us too much, and that's why I was not a big fan of this movie.
I definitely agree with that. When you start off the movie, there's not really many main differences between the what's going on in the galaxy then and at the then when the movie ends. The biggest difference is that like the Palpatine's plans are starting to come to fruition a bit. He's mingled his way into becoming the chancellor now, and he got Valorum out of power. But for the average like movie going experience, it doesn't really seem like a big deal. Like he's the emperor, or he's going to be in the future, but it doesn't really it's not really any like tangible like they saved the day, but you weren't really invested in the day that was being saved. Naboo. You're told Naboo is peaceful and is a cool place, and that the Confederacy, the not the Confederacy, the droid armies are there, and they're this big blockade, Trade Federation, but you don't really care about this stuff. Whereas when you see in the original trilogy, when you see those characters and you go to those planets there, like, you care about what's going on there because you get more invested into the people there in the world. So they introduce you to people because they're important, whereas here they introduce you to people and say, look, they're important, like them.
Right, right. Once again, I didn't have this super high on my list. I had it number 7, which is a little less than the middle. I think we all had slightly different criterias when we were ranking these lists. I think one of the reasons why this spiked a little higher on my list than your guys' list, specifically, is because of the context in which the movie was made and when it was made. Once again, as I said, the image of what Star Wars was and what Star Wars could be was very much influenced by this movie. On top of that, I really did enjoy Liam Neeson's performance as Qui-Gon, and I do wish that he was in the movies longer. But just as a last word, I can definitely understand why people would rank this lower. Now, moving on to what ended up at number 9 on our list, we have Attack of the Clones, Episode 2. Now, to kick this one off, I want Alex actually to kick this one off, because to be quite honest, Shulman and myself do not view this movie quite as, or do not remember this movie quite as great as you do, or have as fond of memories as you do. So I'd like you to go first and you to make your case for why Attack of the Clones is a good movie.
So I really, really, really enjoy this movie, and outside of the original trilogy, this is my favorite movie, and I know that's a very, very controversial opinion. And I know I touched on this a little when we talked about The Phantom Menace, but when you take the prequels as a whole, you know how it has to end. And the worry is when you go too far back in time, you then are not able to fill in the gaps completely. So you're restricted in the time limit. So the prequels, in my opinion, as a trilogy, have a very low potential and they come very close to fulfilling it. And this movie is a main reason why. If you can get past the sappy love scenes between Anakin and Padme, which do play a crucial role, you just don't realize it in this film. There is so much action that goes on in this film. You have Padme's assassination attempt. Then you have the whole scene where Anakin and Obi-Wan are flying through the sky trying to catch the bounty hunter or the assassin, which leads them to find the bounty hunter. And then you have the whole sequence of Obi-Wan needing to find this missing planet, going to this planet, finding the bounty hunter, discovering that there's a whole clone army built for the Republic. And then you have the whole massive fight scene, which is my absolute favorite scene from the entire saga. And I love it. I watch it so often because this is what Jedi are supposed to do. Jedi are supposed to come in, they're supposed to save the day, and they do exactly that. And then you get the scene where you see Yoda showing what Yoda is supposed to do, be a complete badass going after Count Dooku. And, that's just so many great action points in the movie. I feel like outside of the sappy love scene, it's non-stop action, which is what you expect when you go to see a Star Wars movie like this. Plus, you're then able to take this movie and get the whole Clone Wars series. If they had gone a different direction with this movie, you might never have gotten one of the most popular aspects of the whole Star Wars franchise. So I think this movie is very underrated by a lot of people, and you can agree with me, you can disagree with me, but I'm gonna stand fast in that opinion.
All right, I'm gonna disagree with you there. Uh, so a lot of this movie just does not make sense and is very contrived. Um, a lot of the dynamic between the characters is very uh, like superficial and kind of just there for the sake of it. So and you got Anakin and Padme, who they're you know they are off doing their own thing, and they meet up together at the beginning of the movie, and all of a sudden it's like Anakin that's all he's ever thought about. You get the opinion in the when you first meet little Anakin in the Phantom Menace. He's like, oh, this pretty girl, whatever, but he's like 8 and she is like 13 or 12 or whatever. I don't know exactly how old they are, but there's no like clear like he's infatuated by her. He's obsessed with her, and there's really no like indications. Like all of a sudden he just woke up one day and is like, oh, Padme's back. I'm in love with her. Like, and their relationship, they seem to be fighting it the whole time. Like they argue with each other a lot, and yes, like people argue with their loved ones all the time, but it just doesn't. It's not believable. You can't. I'm not convinced that she falls in love with him throughout this movie. He can be creepily obsessed with her for all he wants to be, but it doesn't work in my opinion. There's a lot of other. It's just there's a lot of just boring scenes in this movie. The big mystery that Obi-Wan goes to solve about the clone army and the Caminos. The big mystery is resolved because they're like, oh, like who made this clone army? What's going on? Who hired the bounty hunter? Oh, it was Jedi Master Sifo Dyas. Who's that? Doesn't matter. He's dead already. That's a very unfulfilling like answer to the big mystery that he's working to solve. They go, oh, there's this big army that was made for us. What's going on there? Or it's just they're gonna ignore it because it's not important to looking into. And then what you were saying about at the very end, the last thing I'm going to talk about is the Battle of Geonosis when the Jedi are swooping in to save the day and be the heroes. That's not what the Jedi are supposed to do. The Jedi are the keepers of peace. They're supposed to try and solve conflicts peacefully, quietly, and get in there and get things done. The violence is supposed to be a last resort, and well, like that's not what the Jedi are supposed to do. This movie shows that the Jedi in the prequel trilogy have really lost their ways and are not the idealistic leaders that they pretend that they are. Which like I'll go with that the movies shows that off, but I just don't care for this movie one bit.
Now, me personally, I could have went a couple different ways in this movie. So to be honest, when I was a kid, I had the original trilogy on VCR, and then, as a young kid, I had, for some reason, only Attack of the Clones on DVD. So I did end up watching Attack of the Clones a lot when I was around 6 years old, 7 years old. And what I will say is I really did not enjoy it that much as a kid. I think I think Shulman kind of hit this. I just really thought it was boring as a movie. Granted, at the time, as a kid, I was not super invested in the plot of Star Wars. And I know Alex says that he enjoys the action in the movie. I enjoy the action in the movie, but I really only enjoy the action in the movie at the end scene that Alex was talking about. I really didn't care for the bounty hunter scene. I really didn't care too much about the Boba Fett or Jango Fett Obi-Wan scene. I personally like I do understand that there was a lot of universe building in this movie, which I do want to give it credit for, but just as a movie, it came off very, very boring to me, which is why I put it last on my list. Now, moving on, we're going to go right to number 8, which we have Episode 9, Rise of Skywalker. Now, Rise of Skywalker is the newest movie within the Star Wars universe, and also, partially due to 8, has had a lot of controversial opinions formulated around it, which it was always going to have no matter what. Now, I personally I had this right at 8 as well, so this is very similar to my list. I went back and forth on Rise of Skywalker a lot. I feel like a lot of fans did. Now, granted, I like J.J. Abrams personally, and I do understand that it was hard to make a cohesive story after what The Last Jedi gave you. But I, for one, liked a lot of things that happened in this movie, but also didn't like a lot of things that happened with this movie. And personally, I feel like this movie in particular, although it was nonstop action, which I did appreciate, I felt like a lot of the scenes and character arcs in that movie didn't really hit me exactly right. They all were just kind of in there just to be there, or they didn't feel fulfilled character arcs. And then the ending of the movie, you get where Rey says she's a Skywalker. I really really didn't care for that, and frankly, really didn't care for them to bring Palpatine back. I liked how the ending was, and I really really didn't need that as a Star Wars fan. How do you guys feel about this movie?
Rise of Skywalker is a very interesting movie, in my opinion. I think that the biggest problem I have with Rise of Skywalker, or one of the big problems I have with it, is that it feels like the last two movies of the trilogy. Whereas when I was talking about the Last Jedi earlier, how it feels like a part one and part two of the same movie with that and Force Awakens. This movie feels like the the second part of a trilogy and the third part of a trilogy. Where at the beginning, like we get all of the the characters that we've tried to grow attached to in these movies. Get Finn and Poe, BB-8, 3PO, Chewie, and Rey. They all go off on this adventure, which is great. They're working together as a team, and it's the kind of thing you want to see in the middle of the franchise. When everyone's getting together, not at the very end when we're not going to see them again for a while. It felt like it was a missed opportunity earlier in the franchise to get them together. But on its own, this movie was just very bloated with a lot of different things. Uh, the biggest problem I have with this whole trilogy is that it wasn't really planned out besides the first movie. They pretty much, after Force Awakens, they were like, all right, like, what are we going to do next? Instead of having, like, a clear vision of where to go from there. So then after Last Jedi, they were like, all right, what do we do now? And so a lot of the decisions don't feel like, it feels like you have to stretch a lot to make some of the decisions from Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker work. Like the reveal that Rey's parents are Palpatines.
Ooh,
Oh,
spoiler.
no,
No, I'm just kidding.
like they were, when she was told, "Oh, your parents are nobodies," but oh, it's from a certain point of view, they're nobodies. Like it's a big Star Wars thing, but it's always been like a kind of a cop out, you know.
Right.
So it just felt like they were like, "Oh, you didn't like this about the Last Jedi? Like let's try and turn this into context that you will like it." And instead of they didn't stick to their guns enough about all this stuff. I really enjoyed probably my two favorite scenes from this movie are when Rey goes back to Octu and talks to Luke, and Luke finally uses the Force and pulls his X-wing out of the water like Yoda did way back when in Empire. That coming full circle in the whole saga there felt like a really good earned scene. Um, Ben Solo was fantastic. His redemption in there, like once he became Ben Solo again, his character was great, and I wish that spoiler alert, that he did not die at the end. And for reasons, for story reasons, he had to die. But I wish that we could see more of Ben Solo being the light side of Jedi, and the scene at the end when all the Jedi are one with Rey, and they're all standing up to fight it was a great scene. Getting to see or getting to hear. I wish we could have seen, but we got to hear from Qui Gon and Obi Wan, Yoda, and then a lot of those are like the big Jedi from the movies. But then Ahsoka was there from Clone Wars and Rebels. Kanan was there from Rebels, and a lot of the minor Jedi were there as well. Or not minor, but like minor in the grand scheme of the movies. It was cool to dig that deep into the franchise.
All right, let's throw this over to Alex. Alex, how do you feel about this movie?
Obviously, it's the newest movie, and I haven't had as much time to digest this movie as some of the other ones. But my initial thoughts when I walked out of the theater to now haven't really changed too much in that it was way too much fan fiction. Everything, every little thing that could have happened that fans would have liked to see happened. And that's not how Star Wars is supposed to go. Star Wars is supposed to take these turns that surprise you, and you're like, where did this come from? Like, and that really threw me off. There were some really nice touches, and Schulman did mention them. Luke pulling out the X-wing was very emotional, and that was the peak of the movie. But that shouldn't be the peak of the final Star Wars movie. That shouldn't be the peak. And you look at the corny moments. Like, I know this was that they were put in a very difficult position with Carrie Fisher's passing, but she deserves a little bit of a better ending than that. She shouldn't have died the same way Luke did. And again, I know they were in a very difficult position, but I think they could have been able to do something a little more. The kiss between Ben and Ray didn't wasn't there for it. You know that appeals to your teenage girls who probably weren't Star Wars fans until the last 4 or 5 years. And I still really haven't come to grips with it. Was just too much. This whole last trilogy felt like they wanted to all be three different movies that all shocked us, and they all as together fell flat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of that. Hashtag Raylo, by the way, for all those Raylo fans. I didn't mind the kiss personally, but yeah, I definitely that scene felt awkward and forced. Let's just move right along then. Going to number 7, we have Solo, a Star Wars story. Now, me personally, I had this a couple down. I had it at 9. Going into the theater, watching this movie, I thought it was a good movie. I thought it was okay, potentially deserving of being in the around the middle lower part of the list. However, looking back on it and rewatching it, and knowing that they're really never gonna make a sequel to this, even though they left a lot of doors open, it doesn't feel as good or as interesting of a movie to me because I know those doors will never be explored. On top of that, the Han Solo in the movie, I thought he was okay. I like Donald Glover as well, but I thought he was okay as well. And overall, the movie, I really didn't need the movie as well. As I said previously with the Marvel thing, and with franchises such as Marvel and Star Wars, it's always kind of about making a good movie and alluding to what's next. But when you know there's not going to be a what's next, and you really know that this movie didn't serve a big purpose at all, it really didn't feel that great to me, which is why, frankly, I put it at number 9 on my list. Now, how
I'll
did
go
you
ahead
guys
and
feel?
share my thoughts
Yeah.
because uh, my thoughts are very brief. I went into the theater to watch this movie with no expectation for it. I thought it was just going to be this nice filler movie to kind of get us through this time where they in between the major episodes. But I was pleasantly surprised. Not to say that it was a good movie by any stretch, and I think the one of the reasons why I did have it so high, not high, but in the position it was on my list, I had it at number 8 is because I did have no expectations for it. And I was thoroughly entertained. There were some nice areas in the movie. There were some, you know, again, you got some surprises in during the movie that you didn't expect the outcome to be what it was. And that's a lot of the things I enjoy of Star Wars come from that. So while it might not have been a terrific movie or one that fans will talk about when they talk about the greatest Star Wars movies, it definitely did serve its purpose and was an entertaining movie to any true Star Wars fan.
On my list, I have Solo ranked as number 5. It's a bit high compared to most other people and the general thought on this movie, but before Rise of Skywalker, I went through and rewatched all of the series, and I found myself really enjoying this one on a rewatch. I think the Kessel Run is a fun sequence. I think that Donald Glover did a great job as a Lando Calrissian. Uh, I think young Han Solo, like the actor who played him, I'm drawing a blank on his name, but he was all right. I think this movie had a lot of problems behind the scenes when the original directors had to back out because of creative differences, and that really like hurt this movie a lot. I could tell there were some scenes and some things that they did with characters that seemed like it was going to be we're going to go a different way that didn't really. But I think it was a fun experience overall. I don't think it really needs to set up a sequel and like where the franchise is going to go from there. I think that it's fun and it's fine to do little side adventures that don't really go anywhere, but just show you more of the world and build it out and flesh it out. You see the Empire from a different point of view when Han goes to sign up for the Academy. You see them with the war propaganda doing the Imperial March, and it's really cool. I liked a lot of the characters in this movie, and it was cool to see Maul again at the end. See a little bit about what he's been up to in between the last time we see him in the Clone Wars, which is currently airing right now on Disney Plus, and when we see him again in Rebels. So it was a fun movie.
Right. I definitely agree with that on a lot of points. I do want to clarify a point that I made earlier. I do also agree that not every movie needs to set up a sequel, such as other movies on this list that we're going to get to very shortly. But I just felt like they teased at a sequel on this movie with the Darth Maul, and I forgot the girl's name, going with Darth Maul. It felt like they were definitely hinting at a sequel, and they thought this movie was going to do a lot better than it did. However, it didn't, which is why I was saying that they set up for a sequel that's not going to happen. But moving right along. Oh, go ahead. We can.
I think that more than setting up a sequel, I think it was more just like a fun reference for the greater Star Wars universe to know, like, because in the Clone Wars we see a lot of when Maul comes back, we see him slowly start to amass this like criminal empire in the underworld, and a lot of that's like been referenced in other material, like his different gangs and stuff. And so it was cool to see that there's a bigger picture out there that he's still out there and he's still got this criminal empire for now, and he's still trying to expand, even though the emperor is out there and the empire is going on. So I don't think it was really setting up for a sequel, more as just setting up for something we could possibly see in expanded material.
Right. Okay. I could definitely understand that. Let's move right along. Finally, are cracking the top 5. Now we have a tie for 5, with Rogue One and Episode 3: Revenge of the Sith. Now let's begin by just talking about Rogue One. Speaking on a one-off. Now this movie as well, I remember reading in the news, having a whole bunch of problems going on with production and stuff. Now I had Rogue One at 5, so I think pretty highly of this movie, which is surprising considering I really, going into the theater, had very little expectations for it, because all the characters I didn't have a reason to care about going into the movie. There was no nostalgia there. On top of that, I was hearing all this bad publicity about abundance of reshoots and 30 plus minutes of the movie being cut before even going into the theater. So I was really, really skeptical going in. However, what we got, which is what I was hoping Solo was a little more of, is we really got a really good one-off story. Everybody's arc in that movie was filled. And then we also got a really cool Darth Vader scene at the end. Now, to begin this topic, I want to throw it over to Shulman first about his opinions about this, and then we'll go to Alex.
All right, on my list, I have Rogue One, the Star Wars story, at number 6. I think it's a really good story, and it's a really interesting dynamic between its cast of characters who don't really fit the typical like Star Wars protagonist roles. It really shows like the dark side of the rebellion, because when you really think about it, they were kind of like terrorists, trying to overthrow the empire. It was cool to see that not everyone was bright-eyed and idealistic in the rebellion, like Luke and Leia were. Some of them were more realist, like Cassian, who at the very beginning was shocking. He straight up murders a dude who was there on his side because he was going to be a liability, and I thought that was cool. But as the movie goes on, it's got a lot of cool scenes with the Death Star, and the Vader scene at the end was really good. Probably the best scene in the movie, but it's just such a slog to get to the good part. It as the movie like goes on, it builds up. I remember sitting in the theater being really bored by the beginning, and then I'm like, okay, it's starting to get more interesting in the middle, and by the time they get to the very end, and like they're storming the beaches, which that actual scene was cut from the movie, but when they're stealing the plans from the Death Star and doing all this stuff, it got really interesting. And when they send in all the troops at the end, and there's the big battle while they're trying to get the plans out, like it was really like cool. But it took so long to get there that in my opinion, it just wasn't as good as it could have been.
How do you feel about this one, Alex?
My thoughts are very similar to Shulman. I had this movie at number 7, and we're at the point in the list where the differences are so close, and my thoughts are very similar. I liked this movie because it did, as opposed to Solo, where it did give more of a bridge between what was happening in the trilogies, which is I think the main positive of this movie. And if you can go back after watching this movie to then watch the original trilogy, you'll be very surprised how much this movie helps establish some of your understanding that when you watch the original trilogy for the first time, you had no context for. Obviously, the iconic scene with Vader is probably the saving grace of this movie, as was mentioned in the beginning, very slow, and I wouldn't necessarily call the end scene very good. It just was the best part of the movie. And again, this is a mediocre movie, but it definitely has an important purpose in bridging the story that the other spin-off movie Solo did not.
I think that's very interesting how we all have, or that I have a little bit of a slightly different opinion than you guys on this movie in particular. I, I I will say I do think that the end scene. I don't know if you guys know this. The end scene with Darth Vader was actually shot after the movie was done. It was like a little thing at the end that may have not even been in the movie. So perhaps if that was not in there, that might have brought Rogue One a little farther down on my list. But honestly, I really did enjoy that scene. Like we really haven't gotten that much crisp like Darth Vader action in his prime, I guess you could say, in the movie scene. So I think I really enjoyed that. Now, as well, tied with number 5, we also have Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Now, Alex, would you like to give the first word on Revenge of the Sith?
Sure. Revenge of the Sith is an interesting movie because, as I've referenced every time we talk about a prequel, is how it ends. And so we know where we leave off in Attack of the Clones and we know where we have to get. And this movie, I think, does a very good job of getting us there in a concise but entertaining manner. Obviously, you know what's going to happen with Anakin, and you do get some really good scenes. It's a nice scene where you have the the Jedi all going into attack Palpatine. You see again. I love my badass Yoda. So when he goes in there and tries to take on the Emperor, to um, and then you have the iconic scene with the fight between Obi-Wan and Anakin, and everyone always loves the quote, "It's over for you. I have the high ground now." And that scene is really the climax of the prequels, and I think they did a really good job showing how the relationship between Anakin and Obi-Wan deteriorated. So when you get to episode 4, you see how fragmented that relationship is, even though Darth Vader and Obi-Wan share the screen for such a small time. This movie does a really good job of showing you of giving you that perspective of how we got there. And this movie, I think, was cl- clearly the most important movie of the prequels, but I still think, in terms of my entertainment value, Attack of the Clones was better.
Now, I want to jump in here second because I have a similar opinion to you on this topic. I actually, this is so I said I had two hot takes on this list. My second hot take is I had um, episode 3 at number 3 on my list. Now, I this was the first Star Wars movie I got to see in theaters. I remember it was first grade. It was at my friend John's birthday party. This was the first one I got to see. And this was before I was really, really into Star Wars and I had all the context and I really understood the story. Because at 7, how much can you really appreciate the detail and story of this movie and all the movies? But what I will say is the action that was in this movie and the character development, you could definitely watch this and be like, okay, this was a good movie. It definitely was a redemption, in my opinion, to the prequels quite a lot. I do feel on this movie. Also, this is one of the reasons why Obi-Wan is now one of the beloved characters, as well as Hayden Sin's interpretation of Anakin. It mainly stemmed from this movie. I feel like more so than the other prequels. Another thing on top of this is, as Alex alluded to, is that this is a very important movie. You got to see how Darth Vader really became Darth Vader, as well as some great action sequences within this movie. What I think is really funny is over time, I feel like the opinion of this movie, especially, has softened into people being more favorable of this movie, as it was, even though it was regarded as the best prequel, that it was slightly controversial at the time, as well as the memes for this movie are just obviously it's the most memed movie by far. I'd almost say maybe Attack of the Clones, but there are definitely a lot of memes in this movie. And just overall, the first theater experience, I really really enjoyed this movie, and I still enjoy it to this day, and that's why I put it at number 3 on my list.
Putting this movie on my list, I probably have this lowest out of everyone. I have this at number 9, actually below the Last Jedi, because like I mentioned when I was talking about the Last Jedi, I think that some of the highs are higher in that movie and the lows are lower than they are in this movie. But I feel like this movie was just kind of in average in the middle. I definitely have a newfound appreciation for the story in there after seeing Anakin and Obi Wan and their journey through the Clone Wars and the that show. It definitely like paints this movie in a different light, and you can see more of like what really brought Anakin and his turn to the dark side. Because in this movie, it's very quick and it's very fast, where he goes from you know being a Jedi and being a defender of the light and the peace. He's conflicted about some parts of him, but he goes very quickly from being like a guy who's confused to being a straight child murderer and killing people in cold blood, which wasn't really the Anakin that we saw in the in any of the other movies beforehand. I think that some of the action is the best in the prequels, and I think that the technology was just starting to get to like the right point where they could do a lot of these really cool things, like Grievous, who was underutilized in this movie, and you know there are a lot of really cool things about this movie overall, but it doesn't stand well on its own compared to a lot of the other parts of the franchise. Where I'm going to turn this one on over any of the prequels, but any of the other movies for the most part, I would probably rather watch.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting. I would almost consider that a hot take, Shulman. I would almost consider that a hot take.
I don't know about that. I just think that like there's a lot of wooden performances. Like Hayden Christensen is much better as Anakin than he is in Attack of the Clones, but that's not saying much, and he's not that much better. A lot of the delivery is kind of flat from an acting standpoint. Like it's just not very like compelling the journey that a lot of these characters go on. I think seeing them progress through the Clone Wars and how they get from the start of this war and how it's really taken their toll on them. And then seeing with that context going in this movie improves it a lot. But when this movie first came out and there really wasn't any of this context, it was like it was pretty much they're like, this is the last movie trilogy, like we need to make all this stuff needs to happen so that we can be set up for the original trilogy. So, Anakin's got to be bad. Obi-Wan needs to take his lightsaber. This, that, and that.
Right. I definitely agree with some of the points you said that Grievous was underutilized. But I will say, if I had to pick a movie to put on, if I was between this, Solo, and Rogue One, I would definitely pick Episode 3. Now let's just move right along. Let's break into.
Can I chime back in?
Oh, go for it.
Can I chime back in?
Yeah, chime right back in.
So I want to just touch on the general Grievous thing, because I agree that he was a very underutilized character, considering that we had really not gotten the Clone Wars at this point, or gotten the Clone Wars at all. And also, I think it's important that a lot of people forget the beginning of the movie, when Anakin kills Count Dooku. And I think that is really when you get Anakin to begin that transition to being Darth Vader. Obviously Dooku cuts off his hand at the end of Attack of the Clones, and Palpatine is able to convince Anakin to slice this man's head off, and I think that really opens the door for the rest of the movie. And then I really wish they would have used Grievous more, because you had killed off the side villain Dooku, and then about an hour later, a little more than an hour later, there goes Grievous, and I really think that they missed an opportunity to keep a very interesting and very entertaining character in the franchise.
Mm-hmm.
With that though, he at the end of the day, Dooku is still a war criminal, and while they're supposed to take him prisoner, he was a very dangerous, and no one batted an eye when Anakin killed him. Obi-Wan was knocked out, but when they went back and told the council, they said, "Hey, like, we killed Dooku." No one had a problem with that. It was, it was in battle, he was being attacked. Like, at the end of the day, like, that's a very different kill than Anakin killing all the younglings, and at the end with the Trade Federation, Newt Gunray, and all those guys. They're all unarmed. They think they're on their side, and he just goes and slaughters them all to get rid of the, like. It just that turn is very different. Those are very different kills. It's definitely the start of his descent downwards, but like it goes from this is a bad guy, like I'm killing him because he's a bad person, to I'm gonna kill anybody who gets in my way.
Right. I do definitely agree. Perhaps it would have been better if Grievous was introduced in the second movie, but as it stands, I do understand that at the third movie, like, certain events have to happen. So if you introduce a big villain, everyone's gonna have the question, "Oh, what happened to Grievous?" If you don't kill him off in that movie, especially the people that do not watch the Clone Wars, or I know at the time I'm pretty sure the Clone Wars wasn't really too much into consideration, but I will say his character is fleshed out a lot more in the Clone Wars, which is definitely very satisfying. However, I do understand the perspective of, we're making the movies, things have to happen. If we're making a new character, we have to kill him off. Now let's move right into number 4, I think, because we've spent a long time on Revenge of the Sith. At number 4, which I think is interesting that this became number 4, we have The Force Awakens, Episode 7. Now, when I initially saw this combined list, I was like, wow, The Force Awakens number 4. That's a little surprising. I had it. I had The Force Awakens number 6, so it's actually not too far off. But thinking back on it, thinking back when I came out of the theater, right when I watched The Force Awakens, I feel like me and a lot of people are like, yep, that was the 4th best movie. Now, it is kind of sad that we had a lot of these movies after The Force Awakens, and it's still the 4th best movie. I will say that is a little sad that it still ended up number 4 on our list, and none of these other movies really topped it. I think what that speaks to mostly is that The Force Awakens, it set up a lot of potential that could have happened in the series. Excuse me. Potential that could have happened in a lot of these movies, but I think it speaks of why The Force Awakens is so much higher than these other movies, is at least we felt that the potential that was set up in this movie, while maybe somewhat fulfilled, was not entirely fulfilled and was ultimately a letdown, which is why its succeeding movies didn't surpass it in the rankings. Now, let's throw this over to Shulman first to get the first word on this. How do you feel about The Force Awakens at number 4?
Force Awakens at number 4 is exactly where it is on my list. I think that this is a great film. Overall, it's a good mix of action, and you really start to learn about these new cast of characters. You get a good sense of who they are and what's going on. The rest of the sequel trilogy was not really as planned out very well as this movie. This movie, from the start, they came in hit the ground running with a lot of great ideas and a lot of setup for things that could have been expanded upon later on that just weren't fleshed out because the directors and the creative team didn't think far enough ahead to come up with solutions to these questions. They just raised them because they thought that they would be interesting. I think it's a good reintroduction into the world of Star Wars after the very mixed reviews that the prequels got. And I think it's the big criticism behind this movie is that it's so similar to A New Hope, the original Star Wars movie. And I think that it's honestly a good thing that it's similar because it was taking a lot of similar aspects to it, but kind of making them newer and fresh for a new audience, while at the same time like leaving room to explore new things in the future. I think that when they went into the movie, they said we're gonna keep things pretty familiar. We're gonna show people what they want, what Star Wars is all about again. And going forward, we're gonna do our part to surprise them and make things more different. And I think that they just screwed the pooch on that part. But this movie was good overall.
How do you feel about this movie, Alex?
We all have very similar thoughts on this movie, and I actually had it at number 5 on my list. When you walked out of the theater, at least I know I did, and it sounds like you guys did too. You walked out of the theater and you're like, wow, this was a very good movie. It's the best one we've seen since the original 3. And and you realize when you walked out, you're like, they set this up so well. There is so much potential for what can happen. And I think this movie is a main reason why people didn't like both The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalkers, because this movie was very, very good. You know, it had its touches to the original trilogy, which you needed to have with the main 3 characters, Luke, Leia, and Han, but then it did a great job of tying in this new world of characters while maintaining the balance. And this was just overall, I thought, a very good movie. I was very entertained. It opened up so many questions that while we might not have gotten the answers to, that shouldn't take away from this film and how good it was and how relieved I think so many Star Wars fans were to walk out of the theater and say, wow, like Star Wars is back. Like they hit the nail on the head with this one.
Right. I think we were all pretty much in the same boat on this movie. Now having the dichotomy of that, where at number 3 we have Episode 4, A New Hope. Now, as I was saying, the dichotomy between The Force Awakens and A New Hope is The Force Awakens was the first one in the sequel trilogy, and the other 2 are ranking lower than it. Whereas A New Hope was the first in the original trilogy, and it ranks the lowest, signifying that the other 2 movies built off what A New Hope started. Now, I had this movie right at number 4 because, as I said, I really, really enjoyed Revenge of the Sith, but not to knock A New Hope as a bad movie. Obviously, it's in my top 4. It made top 3 on this list. It's a very, very good movie. This is the movie that kicked off everything. This is the movie that started Star Wars. We didn't know whether it was going to be, or George Lucas, didn't know whether this was going to be a big hit or not. I remember hearing that him and Steven Spielberg had a little bet about profits between E.T. and Star Wars because he really didn't think that Star Wars was going to make any money. However, it became an instant classic and was actually kicked off everything. If A New Hope failed, we wouldn't have had anywhere near as many movies as we ended up having. With that said, why I think it ranked a little lower than the other two on the original trilogy is I do feel like it had to start and develop the world a little bit, which that takes time. Exposition definitely takes some time, and it was a little slower to progress. It did kick in at the end. You obviously have the classic scene of the Death Star. You have the classic scene of Obi-Wan and Darth Vader. But it was overall it was a little slower, and it had to introduce the characters, which is not a detriment to the movie, but it has to be done when you're beginning a trilogy. Now let's throw this right back to Alex. How do you feel about A New Hope, and how does this ranking compare to your list?
Just like you, I had this movie at number four. It's because just as much as you love Revenge of the Sith, I love Attack of the Clones, and that's why I have it at number four. But this movie fulfilled its potential completely. Um, and you had, as you said, you had to develop the world, you had to introduce these characters, and the fact that it's the lowest out of the trilogy, out of the original trilogy, and number three on the list shows just how good the other two movies were. Not that this is a bad movie at all. I mean, the visual and digital effects that this movie put on display were so far beyond anything that had been seen before, and it really got it hit the ground running for this whole franchise. And you know, if they hadn't been so perfect with this movie, we wouldn't have gotten to the top two movies on our list. And I think that's something that people underappreciate about A New Hope, or I guess as it was called back then, Star Wars.
How do you feel about this, Shulman?
On my list, I have this movie ranked as number three, and I think it's really interesting how the when you look at this all these movies of the original trilogy, the on our list at least, the original movie is at the lowest, but at the sequels, the original movie is the highest. I think that it's a lot of that is because of expectations going into the movies, and also a lot of just what those movies are for the franchise. You know, A New Hope is the entry point to everything. It has to do a lot of work, set up the entire universe, everything. Not that it was trying to set up this whole saga. It has its own self-contained story of what's going on in this universe, but it does a lot of different things because there's nothing like it before. And I think that part of what makes the two movies we have on this list that are above it so good is that it builds off of the ground. So it was already so high up that the other two movies built up from what this movie did. There's so much good about this movie that it makes the other movies on this list better.
Right. I think we're all pretty much in agreement with this movie and the original trilogy, which that brings us right to number two. We have Return of the Jedi, Episode 6, as our number two spot. Now, to be completely honest with you guys, I did have this number two, but definitely as a kid, and potentially also now, I would maybe consider this movie as my favorite Star Wars movie. I really enjoy endings, and more than that, I really enjoy good endings. I feel like this movie really, really had an impactful one of the best endings of a series ever. On top of that, I do feel like this movie, like even though it's at the number two spot, I do feel like in previous years at least, this movie was definitely underrated. I know a lot of people would rank this one as the lowest movie in the original trilogy years past. However, I'm happy it made the two spot. I'm happy it was above A New Hope. I really enjoyed the desert scene. I really thought that was really good action as well. Very satisfying lightsaber fights and development on Luke, and I thought that whole scene was very, very interesting. And I'm really glad this ended up number two, and it was the perfect ending to the original trilogy. Now, Shulman, where did this end up on your list, and how do you feel about it being on the two spot?
So before my most recent rewatch of the entire franchise, Return of the Jedi was number one for me. Uh, I thought that the movie was perfect. That it is a little bit of a slog in the middle. There's not much really going on when they first get on Endor, the Forest of Endor. But for every little second that's boring, you have the masterpiece that's setting up for the climactic showdown between Luke and his father on the Death Star. You have the encounter with the Emperor up there, and we really see who this person is for the first time. You've been hearing about him for two movies now, and you see what kind of a person this is. If Vader, this commanding presence, this scary guy, this is the only guy in the world who he is afraid of. This is his master. Like, he's a big deal. I thought the action was great. Um, One of my favorite scenes in all of Star Wars is the attack on the barge when they rescue Han Solo and they from Jabba, the Sarlacc pit. It's just classic Star Wars. It's fun. It's action packed. It's adventure, and I think it's the franchise. Even though it's not number one, this movie is a lot of what makes the number one movie number one wouldn't happen without the conclusion to that story from here.
Right. Alex, how do you feel about this movie, and where did it rank on your list?
I actually had this as my number one movie, but this is not to knock The Empire Strikes Back. They're 1A and 1B. And this one, as you, Steve, you took the words right out of my mouth. I love endings. And this was the perfect ending. You know, it picked up right where Empire Strikes Back left off. It did a great job of that. You progressed to the scene that everybody wanted to see. Everyone wanted to see Luke fight his father. Was he going to join the Empire, or was he going to prevail? And was the good side, the light side, the Jedi, were they going to win? And you got that. You got all that and everything in the middle. Plus, you have Ewoks. How did we talk about this movie? We've been talking about it for what, 5 minutes now? Nobody mentioned an Ewok. I mean, when you look at 1A and 1B, that's the tiebreaker for this movie. Ewoks, plain and simple.
I actually really like the Ewoks. I don't think that they're that bad as people make them out to be. Uh, the they're they symbolize like a big like contrast between like nature and the technology. They live off the land. They're not very advanced, but they're able to put up a fight and defend their home from the Empire, who's very technological advanced and very like developed. So I think it's a fun little contrast between the two of them. I think that they're kind of harmless, and it shows off like another little fun race in the Star Wars universe, its own little species. And I honestly like don't think it's that big of a deal.
Yeah, I definitely do understand the Ewok point. I know they did get flack. As a kid, I didn't really think anything of it, but looking back, I don't think it necessarily detracted from the movie, but I definitely think that potentially they could have picked some other sort of aliens on that planet. Well, that brings us finally. We've hit it. Number one on the list. We have The Empire Strikes Back, Episode 5. Now, this by the community, I would say, is regarded by most people as the best movie. Now, me having to describe this movie, I would describe it as a space drama and suspense, and having the plot twist that shook the movie community to this day. To be honest, probably the biggest plot twist in the history of movies. I think what was really interesting about this movie is it did have its share of action in the beginning specifically and at the end. However, where a lot of the Star Wars movies has this problem, which we were just alluding to, Return of the Jedi, even though it's a great movie, about having a lull in the middle. It filled the middle with character development and suspense and drama, and taking what we thought about these characters when we just met them in A New Hope and developing them even further and convoluting their motives and understanding even the villain better, and perhaps he's maybe not that bad of a guy, or maybe he is. And overall, just an amazing movie, goes down in history as honestly one of the best movies of all time, because of those reasons I stated. Now, Alex, I want you to get the second word on this one. How do you feel about the Empire Strikes Back, and how do you feel about it landing number one on our list?
Between this and Return of the Jedi, you can't go wrong with either at number one. As I said, I had this as number two, but it's really a 1B. Um, on a serious note, it really wasn't Ewoks that differentiated Return of the Jedi for me. But when you look at this movie as a whole, if you take out that moment where you find out that Darth Vader is Luke's father, you take that moment out, and I don't think it's as good as Return of the Jedi. Obviously, that is the most important moment of the movie, of the trilogy, of the whole franchise. That is the movie. But other than that, the movie was kind of a little shaky at points. And it definitely, as you said, the middle was better than a lot of the other middles of the movies. That I think that is the bugaboo of this series, is that the middles of all the movies fall a little flat, and this movie didn't really. But if you take out that one climactic moment, I think it falls short of Return of the Jedi. It's still a great, great movie, and you can't go wrong putting it number one on this list.
Right, Shulman, how do you feel about this movie and what Alex and I have been talking about so far?
The one thing that I will have to say that I have a different opinion on is I do not think the middle of this movie is slow at all. The only part that I would say is kind of a little drag is maybe the like when Han and Leia and the whole crew of the Falcon, they're doing that little chase in space and trying to get away from the Empire that's always on their tail. But even then, it's a lot of character development for the characters. It's a lot more fast paced than the chase we have in the Last Jedi. Even though they barely get a second to breathe, and they're a little back up again in danger, always in trouble. This movie is what really like pushed Star Wars into the next level. You know, we hear, oh, like Luke's father was a Jedi. Like I'm gonna be a Jedi, but we don't really know what that means until we get to this movie. You know, they study this movie in like film school for a reason. It's a masterpiece in effects, in storytelling, in color, and lighting. Everything about it is just perfect. Like there's nothing else to say about it.
Yeah, I'd say this pretty much exactly what you guys said. The Empire Strikes Back, definitely understanding why it's number one on our list. I want to throw this right back to Alex real quick. You have any other thoughts on this movie?
So I just want to clarify at least what I said, and I think Steve and I were on the same page, and maybe you didn't quite understand it, Shulman. I think Steve and I both agreed that the middle of this movie was good,
Yes.
especially when you do compare it to the other movies, and Steve can chime back in after and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was both of our points. And also, this movie, one scene that we didn't touch on was Luke going to find Yoda on Dagobah, and I think that was a very important scene in this movie. It's when Luke truly discovers who he is, and you see the first split in Luke's character because Luke wants to go face his father head on, and Yoda, the wisest character, doesn't think he's ready, and that's when you begin to see which path will Luke go on. Maybe he is going to end up like his father and fall to the wrong side because he's too stubborn. But then again, you see, and this kind of gets the ebbs and flows of Luke's character, which make him one of the greatest characters in cinematic history.
Mm-hmm. Anything else, Shulman, or do you want me to start
Um,
wrapping this up?
my last thoughts about Empire uh, as a whole. There's too much to talk about with this movie
Mm-hmm.
between all the great locations, all the plot. It really is. There's nothing wrong with this movie, and it's number one for a reason.
Right. All right, so what I will do, if you are watching this on YouTube, I'm going to link all of our lists in the comments as well as the master list. If you have any differing opinions or agree with some of our points, feel free to leave a comment and we'll definitely get to that. If you enjoy just listening to me and some of my friends talk about whatever we want to talk about, feel free to subscribe. I want to thank you, Alex, and thank you, Shulman, for joining me on this podcast today. I think we had a really, really great conversation about Star Wars. And, maybe our opinions, although some different, I think we all came to an understanding about why we have those opinions. All right, well, that pretty much concludes this episode. Thank you all for listening, and we'll catch you next episode.